Welcome back to Law and Crime. I'm Carissa Kranz. Now to the story that has gripped the nation for a while. Since July 18th, Molly Tibbetts, America's sweetheart, went missing. There was a search for her body. Everyone was hoping and raising money to bring her back alive and safe. But unfortunately, a body was found yesterday, and a press conference was held yesterday, and an undocumented alien is now a suspect in custody. KrisAnne, let's talk about this for a second. How does it look for this suspect? He's been making some pretty serious admissions, if we're to believe what he says.
Well, yeah, I think this is not looking good for him at all. He not only made some admissions, but he directed them to her body and told them exactly what happened. And the fact that she was jogging, and that he tried to speak to her, and that she threatened to call the cops. And it's the testimony that he says afterwards, where he says, you know, I blacked out my memory because I got angry. And that sort of makes me wonder, is he trying to set up some kind of a defense of temporary insanity? But the fact that he mentions that he got so angry that he blacked out his memory is also going to be something that's not going to be very good for him in court.
Sure. Well, it's probably he blacked out because he freaked out because he's an undocumented alien. And when she said she's going to call the cops, you know, in this political climate of aliens being deported, he probably flipped out, and then it was a traumatic experience. He blacked out, and if he's coached properly, you're probably right, we will likely see some type of temporary insanity defense. However, I don't anticipate it being a successful one, but we'll see, and we'll continue to keep our viewers and everyone here tuned in and tapped on to whatever is new and unfolding in that case here on the network. Now we're going to switch gears again, because that's what we do here at Law and Crime. We cover every trial that we can, gavel to gavel, and the other trial we're in is the Roy Oliver case. It's out of Texas. It's a 2017 case, and this is the case where a former Texas police officer, his name is Roy Oliver, is on trial for the murder of a 15-year-old kid, a teenager named Jordan Edwards. Specifically, there he is on the screen, a straight A student into sports. Such a sad case. The former police officer, Roy Oliver, fired a series of shots into a vehicle full of teenagers leaving a party when Edwards was shot in the head and killed. Yesterday, we saw gruesome pictures of the victim in the car with blood on his hands and hooked up to what looked like monitors to try to save his life. Really sad photos to see. Roy Oliver says he was protecting his fellow police officer. However, body cam footage, which is what we have, and that's the main piece of evidence we have, shows a different set of facts than what the officer is claiming as defense of others. It rather shows a more of an excessive force argument, which is what the prosecution is saying. However, the defense is saying that this was reasonable under the circumstances. What was going on under the circumstances? There was a house party. There were hundreds of kids there. There was a gang shooting across the street where 12 shots fired. It was dark outside. So therefore, under the circumstances, the defense says it was reasonable to respond the way they responded. Prosecution says this was excessive force. The car was not going towards them. The car was going away from them. There was no need to shoot into the car. They could have disabled that car another way. So competing arguments. We don't know what's clear, what's not. That's why we're here covering it. We'll see what the jury thinks. We're going to go into that trial now as we have some testimony in court. Let's take a look.
Hey, Hamburger, come here. Have a seat. Where you go to school?
West Mesquite.
All these West Mesquite kids? Maybe?
Wow, son of Mesquite. Pretty much all the time.
Listen, don't do this again.
Yeah, this is a one-time thing, sir.
Mr. Rhodes, I'm Officer Gross, okay?
Officer Rose.
I don't want to see this again.
Yeah, you'll see this again. I ain't expected to get this
I don't.
type.
Girl. Hey, stop that car! Stop right there! Stop!
60, 61 code, 2312, 64, 63, 10-4, shot him around the silver area.
Stop! Copy 28. Charles Sam 7 Young 882. Charles Sam 7 Young 882. Hey, stop that fucking car! Stop that fucking car right now! That fucking car! You on it? Yeah, fine.
You're trying to hit you.
64, black cat, southbound, Shepherd, 302, standby. Mission gun,
Stop! Stop!
That's the body cam footage, and it's really sad. You just saw basically a life taken at the hands of a police officer. First, you heard 12 shots across the street, and then after you heard, stop that car, stop that effing car, that's when you heard 6 more shots into the car where the teenager was shot and killed in the head, when in reality, the car was probably leaving the scene because of the shooting and just wanted to get away. There was no reason to shoot into the car. Unfortunately, the family is also in the courtroom watching this video being replayed over and over again. And yesterday we saw the family actually get up and out of the courtroom when they showed pictures of the victim in the car with blood. Super sad facts. KrisAnne, based on that video, which is our best evidence that we have, and the jury's ability to replay that over and over again in the jury's during deliberations, what do you think? You think it's going to go for the prosecution or the defense in this case? I mean, there are arguments for both sides.
Yeah, I think historically a lot of the experts, the trend is that it's difficult to convict an officer, that the jurors feel sympathetic to an officer in such a situation. You hear him turn to his partner and say, "Are you okay?" It sounds like he says something like, I thought the car hit you. But then we have also a new kind of understanding in America that, you know, yes, officers can use excessive force, and yes, officers can make mistakes, and officers can make the wrong decisions. So this is going to be a really, really interesting case for the jury, and to find out how our society has changed over just the last few years with the publicity that we've had with officer shootings and the body cam kind of evidence that we've been seeing throughout our news media over the last couple of years.
Okay, and so it's going to come down to whether or not the force used was reasonable under the circumstances, not whether or not the shooting was right or wrong. The standard is, while an officer's in the line of duty, sometimes mistakes happen, sometimes accidents happen. They are responding to emergency situations. So the question is, was it reasonable under these circumstances, under these set of facts, to fire into that car? Along those lines, we have on the stand Philip Hayden. He's a use of force expert. He's a prosecution witness, so we can guess that he is going to say and give testimony that it was not reasonable under these circumstances to shoot into the car and that it was excessive force. But he's an expert on use of force, so let's take a look at what he has to say. Welcome back. That is the use of force expert. His name is Philip Hayden, and he is testifying for the prosecution in the case of Roy Oliver. This is the case where a former police officer is standing trial for shooting and killing a 15-year-old teenager who was leaving a party in a car full of other teens. This officer shot into the car when the car was trying to leave the scene. Hindsight is always 20/20. The question is, was it reasonable force under the circumstances? There's the kid on the screen that was shot and killed. So sad. Straight A student, into sports, an exemplary student who was in the right place at the wrong time. KrisAnne, former prosecutor, is with me. In listening to that testimony, he was pretty clear. He said it was not reasonable for an officer with the same training and experience to fire the gun under those circumstances. Do you agree with him, or is he a hired gun?
Yeah,
so to speak.
I think, yeah, I think from the video evidence that he is very he's very close to the mark. It's going to be interesting to see what the cross-examination comes from this. But, Carissa, we got to remember, this is a jury trial. This is not a bench trial before a judge. So we not only have the black letter law standard, we not only have the legal standard, but we also have a social standard. And that's going to be, as it is in all jury trials, that's going to be the link here that makes the difference one way or another. Juries can be told the law, they can be made to understand the law, but prosecutors know that they don't always follow the law to the letter in the way that a judge would follow the law to the letter, because they have their own emotional and social biases that will come into play when the testimony is received.
You bring up a good point here, too, as well, with the composition of the jury. We don't know what the jury's composition really is, and it is important to note for the viewers, this is a black kid that died at the hands of a white police officer, and that will always play into a verdict, and you're right, they don't always follow the law. We have to take a quick break. Stick with us. We'll be right back with continuing our coverage of this trial. That's Maxwell Everett. He is the friend of the victim, Jordan Edwards, that was shot and killed at the hands of the police officer, Roy Oliver. This is a case where now the former officer is standing trial for murder for using excessive force. That's the victim's face on the screen, a young kid, a straight-A student into sports, at the wrong place, at the wrong time. Very unfortunate situation. His friend obviously is emotional and crying, reliving the moments where he thought his friend had a spilled drink, but instead it was blood all over the car from the shots that killed him, the one in the head. And instead of getting him immediate help, you heard the witness say they all got out of the car and were arrested to show that they weren't resisting the police. And instead of getting his friend immediate help, who was then suffering, dying, and hurt, they were responding to the officers, what the prosecution would say, excessive force. With me, KrisAnne Hall. I want to give you the opportunity to talk about this, comment on this. For me, it's emotional to see a witness break down on the stand like that, and the jury was just dismissed. I'm sure the jurors are taking that. It seems like a good kid, a good friend. They didn't deserve this. I don't think that this officer should have been, I don't think this officer should have had a gun. You know, we know some no. I mean, if you do some, I don't know if the jury's going to know this, but if you do some background research on him, and you see on the internet, he had some road rage incidences 2 weeks before. He was part of a white hate group in middle school. This is an officer that may not have been worthy of his badge or the power bestowed upon him to have weapons within which he used to take an innocent life. What are your thoughts?
You know, this is the part that I was talking about, the fact that it's in front of a jury. You know, these are the moments where the jury is really going to be compelled by emotion, where if it had been a trial before a judge, the judge would be able to put that aside. I find it very interesting that that Oliver's testimony is that he thought that his partner was in danger, when even his partner, Gross, said, no, I was not in danger. And it seems to be very clear from the body cam and from the tone of the voice that Oliver was actually firing at this vehicle because it did not obey his order to stop.
So
and we in the legal field know.
Into the vehicle? Why not fire at the tires to disable the vehicle? Why fire into a car full of kids? I don't understand it. We need to take a quick break. We're going to continue coverage of this trial when we return. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Carissa Kranz. That witness is Reginald Mickens, and he is testifying for the prosecution in the Roy Oliver trial. This is the case where a former police officer is standing trial for murder of a black 15-year-old teenager. The white officer, shot into a car full of teenagers, and unfortunately, one of them died. The question is, did the officer use excessive force, or was his response reasonable under the circumstances? That witness is saying that he couldn't believe what he saw. He was in the car, another car, driving, and that he stopped and witnessed the whole thing. He thought it was a rifle, but he couldn't tell for sure, and that the officer was standing in the street, stomping and angry, obviously not running to rescue or make sure everyone was okay after shooting a series of shots into a car full of young kids. With me, KrisAnne, I want to talk about this. What a case for excessive force the prosecution is making.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very compelling case, too, with lots of emotional components. You and I were both emotionally moved by the testimony of the young man's friend in the car. He couldn't even finish his testimony on the and I think, like I said, because this is a jury trial, this is going to be a very interesting case to watch all the way to the end. And it's also going to be something that may be an indication of a changing social standard, because for the past many years, the society has been able to give a law enforcement officer a benefit of the doubt, has been able to believe a law enforcement officer's testimony even above compelling emotional testimony like this. But we're in a new day and age, a day of the body cam and the day of people in society being outraged and losing their patience with what society is deeming as excessive use of force. So this, like I said, this is going to be a very interesting trial to watch all the way to the end, knowing how this testimony is coming out.
Okay, those are all good points, and we were going to continue to cover this gavel to gavel. And as you can see right now, we have a live feed into the courtroom. We have a new witness on the stand. It's a forensic consultant. His name is Nick Webb. Let's go into the courtroom and see what he's got to say. Welcome back. I'm Carissa Kranz. On the stand right now is Nick Webb. He's a forensic consultant, and he is giving testimony about the gun that was used to shoot into the car full of teenagers in the Roy Oliver trial out of Texas. And he is discussing about the shots being ricocheted, how or why that may mean. KrisAnne, what are your thoughts if you were to sum up his testimony and its significance for the jury?
Well, he's a prosecution witness, so the prosecution is trying to show remember that the vehicle is moving away.
Right, but he's a prosecution witness, but right now they're on cross-examination, so where are they going with this?
Right, well, but the fact that the bullet hit the ground, and that's where the contention is going to be, the fact that the bullet hit the ground, the prosecution wants to show that the vehicle was moving away. Now, the fact that that seems to be a very compelling option, the defense then wants to say, no, it wasn't because the vehicle was moving away. It was because the officer had lowered his firearm, had lowered his weapon, and shot on the ground. And so that's where.
So do you think that they're trying to imply that they were actually trying to possibly shoot at the tires to disable the car and not into the car?
You know, that's a possibility, but I don't see that coming from the defense. What I see is their testimony is like they're getting him to say, no, he was lowering his gun and it went off as he was lowering his gun, and perhaps that he was, sort of finished firing. He had decided not to fire anymore. I think to make the connection that he was trying to shoot at the tires would be a mistake for the defense at this point, because the fact that he hit so far in front of the vehicle would be more proof that they were backing away at the time of the firing.
Okay, all good points. We're going to continue to monitor this trial live in the courtroom where we have a feed. But first, we do have to go to a quick break. When we get back from the break, we'll be back in the courtroom live with in-trial testimony and more in-studio analysis to follow. Stick with us. Welcome back. I'm Carissa Kranz, and that was Nick Webb on the stand. He's a forensic consultant. He's a prosecution witness, and he was testifying as to his training and experience to make him an expert as to whether or not the shots fired into the ground and ricocheted, whether or not that would be reasonable, unreasonable, or justified under the circumstances. KrisAnne, while they're switching witnesses on the stand, because we have a live feed and we're watching the courtroom, let's talk about that and see if that was a helpful witness or more of a technical witness for the jury.
Well, it's like we said right before the break. The defense has to dispute this testimony from the prosecution's witness. And the prosecution is trying to establish a case where the officer was firing a firearm in an unreasonable way and in a reckless way.
But
So
how
we
about the
have
fact that it's just unreasonable to fire a firearm, period, under these circumstances?
Oh yeah, well, absolutely. But remember, the prosecution's going to be building a case that has to go beyond a reasonable doubt. So they want to make sure all their ends are nice and tied off. Whereas the defense now, when you saw him questioning the expert, is asking him about what kind of organizations he's with, what kind of documents that he reads. And what they're going to try to do is establish that he's not as credible as, or not as informed as the prosecution wants him to be. And you'll notice at the end of that testimony, the defense attorney also said that, isn't that consistent with lowering a firearm with assuming a safe position? So they're trying to make the officer appear to be acting in the best and most trained, safe way to dispute the fact that he was being unreasonable and reckless.
Well, in the end, it's going to be up to the trier of fact to decide. That's going to be the jury. Right now, we have another witness on the stand. As you can see on the screen here, we can listen in. Let's see who this witness is. It's a prosecution witness. Let's take a look. We'll be back. Welcome back. As you can see, we have a live feed in the courtroom, and as usual, sometimes there's a break, sometimes there's a recess, and sometimes there's a sidebar. Right now, everyone in the courtroom is rising and having a possible break. So with me, KrisAnne, former prosecutor, KrisAnne Hall. Let's talk about this case for a minute and see how it's going for the prosecution. Do you feel like the jury is taking this case in a defense light or a prosecution's light, based on what we've seen so far today?
You know, it's hard to tell, actually, without seeing the jurors' faces, but I think the evidence that we've seen today will be very compelling towards the prosecution's case. I want to point out that, you know, we mentioned before that there are three aspects of any trial. You have the legal standard, the black letter law standard, and you also have the social standard. And prosecutors are intimately aware of this. You'll notice that on the ledge by the bench that there's a picture of the victim that never leaves. And that's to be a constant reminder to the jury as to why they are here. And I believe that not only does the law help the prosecution in this case, but so does emotion as well.
Right. I mean, you're dealing with a black kid who was a straight A student. He was into sports. He had a sweet face. We also heard testimony earlier today from his friends that were in the car who also seemed like, you know, straight and narrow, buttoned up kids. And there's his face on the screen. Look at that beautiful smile, the glow in his eyes. I mean, his life was clearly taken too soon. And when we listened to his friend testify, he was choked up on his words. He couldn't even finish talking. He said that he thought that it was a drink that was spilled on the victim, Jordan Edwards, when in fact it was blood. And instead of coming to the rescue of his friend, they all got out of the car to get arrested when they needed emergency help to come to him on the scene. And instead of the emergency help, they're getting out of the car, getting arrested. From the body cam footage, that looked like excessive force, but from the officer's narrative, that's a different story. Speaking of the body cam footage, let's go to that. Let's replay it for our viewers, because the jury's going to get to see that over and over and over again, because that video is evidence, and not only is it evidence, it is the best evidence, because it is the most preserved evidence that we have from the scene. Let's go to the body cam.
Hey, Hamburglar, come here. Have a seat. Where are you at school?
West Mesquite.
All these West Mesquite kids? Maybe?
Wow, son of Mesquite, pretty much all the same.
Listen, don't do this again.
Yeah, this is a one-time thing, sir.
Mr. Rhodes, I'm Officer Gross, okay?
Officer Rose.
I don't want to see this again.
Yeah, let me go see this again. I ain't expected to get this
I know.
tight.
Hey, stop that car! Stop right there! Stop!
60, 61 code, 2312, 64, 62, 84. 10 boys, just give around the number of area. Nursing home.
Stop! Copy 28. Charles Sam 7 Young 882. Charles Sam 7 Young 882. Hey, stop that fucking car! Stop that fucking car right now! That fucking car! You alright? Yeah, I'm fine.
He was trying to hit you.
Stop! Stop!
It doesn't matter how many times I see that video, because I've seen it over and over here on the network for the last few days. It's the, you know, the evidence we have from the scene leading up to the actual killing, until the actual killing, and continues after the killing. And every time I see it, I still think it is just so sad. Right now, we have testimony from Eric Knight. He is a friend of the victim. Let's see what he has to say, because his testimony will lend additional insight into what happened that night, which is in addition to the body cam video. And after all, this all comes down to all the evidence being weighed together, not just the body cam, not just the officer's testimony or defense. It's everything.